Okay, start walking, Mila there. There's the longitudinal bulkheads. You ought to see them popping out, lad. There's one right here. There's another one. All right, the lines are there.
The possibility that Noah's Ark may have been found is an intriguing thought, but it's also a challenge to the accepted wisdom of our day. If it could be proved that Noah's Ark was real, then most of our textbooks on ancient history and geology will need to be rewritten. There are theological implications also, because many of the ancient flood stories have been preserved in documents which are revered as containing the Word of God. The story of Noah is found in the Torah and the Old Testament, and is cherished by Jews and Christians alike. It's found also in the Quran, and is a tenet of faith for Muslims. And a similar account is found in over 200 ancient legends, many of which have religious overtones. But the purpose of this presentation is to examine the historical and archaeological record, nothing more. We shall leave the theological questions for others. The story of Noah's Ark in the Bible comes from the 5 books of Moses, which is also part of the Torah. Both books describe a massive flood which destroyed mankind except Noah and his family. We are told that Noah built a boat 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. And this craft, which came to rest upon the mountains of Ararat, became the mothership of man's survival. In the Quran, we find essentially the same story, including the loading of animals, the scoffing of unbelievers, and the ark's final resting place upon a mountain in Ararat. The story of a mammoth flood and its survivors has been preserved in the written and spoken traditions of most of the ancient peoples of the earth. It's found in Northern Europe, Southeast Asia, China, Egypt, North and South America, Africa, India, and the Pacific Islands. The oldest of these records dates back over 4,000 years to the land of Sumer, the world's first known civilization. Stories of the early history of man were written on clay tablets which were copied and spread throughout the ancient world. In the 1840s, hundreds of these tablets were discovered by archaeologists digging among the ruins at Nineveh, the capital city of the ancient Assyrian Empire. The account of the flood was among them, and was discovered on the 11th tablet of a longer story called the Epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh was said to be the king of the city-state of Uruk, who performed many heroic deeds, and then set out to find the secret of eternal life. For many years it was assumed the story was pure myth, but it is now known that Gilgamesh was real, that he was the king of Uruk almost 5,000 years ago, and that he actually did accomplish at least some of the exploits described in the story. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Noah's name is given as Utnapishtim, but otherwise the details are strikingly similar to those in the book of Genesis, the Torah, and the Quran. Even the releasing of birds to locate the direction of land.
The first written language was Sumerian. Sumerian is about 5,000 years old, and its heyday was between 3000 BC and 2000 BC. Its language is not connected to any other language known, which is very unusual.
Marvin Luckerman is the editor and publisher of the magazine Catastrophism and Ancient History. He holds a master's degree in Islamic studies and has pursued the field of archaeology as a participant in excavations in northern Israel. He is a recognized authority in ancient languages.
The Gilgamesh text is not only in Akkadian, in Babylonian, in Assyrian, in Sumerian, in even other texts, Hurrian. It was a text that was done over and over and over again. It was the Iliad of the ancient world. And it was a text that was used and remembered and used in rituals. And it was a text they had to know, just like we have to know the Bible, they had to know the Gilgamesh text. And in that text they found a story of the flood.
One of the most persistent legends of history is that Noah's Ark came to rest high in a glacier on Mount Ararat. But that notion did not originate in the Bible or any other ancient account of the flood. Its origin was the pen of a 4th century writer by the name of Faustus of Byzantine. Faustus wrote that St. Jacob made numerous attempts to find the ark on Mount Ararat, but each time collapsed from fatigue and awoke at the base of the mountain. Then, in answer to a prayer, an angel appeared and gave him a piece of wood taken from the structure. This tale was quoted and requoted by historians for hundreds of years thereafter, and it became the foundation for the present-day legend. The book of Genesis says the ark came to rest not on Mount Ararat, but upon the mountains of Ararat. Ararat was the name for ancient Urartu, later known as Armenia, a part of which is now Turkey. It was the description of a kingdom, an area with numerous mountains. Mount Ararat is just one of them. The Quran says the ark came to rest upon Mount Judi. There are several mountains in that part of the world called Judi, but Mount Ararat is not one of them. Nevertheless, the legend prevails, and for over 100 years men have scrambled over the glaciers of Mount Ararat searching for St. Jacob's Ark. There have been numerous claims of finding the ark. Some have said they saw it from a plane. Others say they climbed the mountain and walked within its chambers. Some have alleged to photograph it, but the photographs have mysteriously disappeared, and the only tangible evidence that remains today are several pieces of hand-hewn wood. They were brought from the mountain by the Frenchman Fernand Navarra, who claimed that he chopped them out of the ice. In later years, Navarra's climbing partners accused him of taking the wood up the mountain for a fake discovery, to create a market for his book, Noah's Ark, I Touched It. One of the most repeated stories about the discovery of Noah's Ark was first published in 1939 in the New Eden magazine, which carried a strange mix of articles advocating nudism, raw foods, and Christianity. The writer of this story was identified as a former Russian aviator named Vladimir Roskovitsky, who described how he saw the ark in 1916 while on a flight over Mount Ararat. He said it was protruding from the ice at the edge of a small lake. A report was made to the government, and the Tsar sent soldiers up the mountain to confirm the sighting. They brought back photographs showing hundreds of rooms with cages. But the Bolshevik Revolution occurred only a short time later, and the photographs were destroyed. This story offered great hope to the believers in the legend of St. Jacob, and it has been retold over the years many times. But in 1976, 37 years later, the editor of the New Eden magazine, Floyd Gurley, revealed that the Russian aviator never existed. He had written the article himself. In a letter to Mrs. Albert Watson in Angwin, California, Mr. Gurley admitted that he had invented the aviator's name and that the article had been fabricated out of a story he heard from a Russian refugee. Perhaps the most colorful of all the discoverers of Noah's Ark was a flamboyant character by the name of John Joseph, who in 1893 arrived in the United States from Baghdad and addressed a meeting of the World Parliament of Religions. He identified himself as Prince Nuri, the head of the Nestorian Church in South India, and gave his credentials as Sacred Crown Supreme Representative, General of the Holy Orthodox Patriarchal Imperiality, the Most Venerable Prelate Monsignor, Prince of Nuri, Chaldean Patriarchal Archdeacon of Babylon and Jerusalem, Grand Apostolic Ambassador of Malabar, India, and Persia, the first universal exploring traveler of 1,000,000 miles, and the discoverer of Noah's Ark. Prince Nuri claimed that he found the ark high on Mount Ararat, half filled with ice and snow, that he walked within its walls, and that its measurements were exactly as prescribed in the Bible. His mission was to raise money to bring the ark down the mountain in pieces and reassemble them at the Chicago World's Fair. In the 3rd century BC, a Babylonian priest and historian by the name of Berosus was captured by the Greeks and translated into their language many of the ancient accounts of the origin and history of man. From these documents we learn two things about Noah's Ark. One is that Berosus said the ark landed in the mountains of Armenia, not necessarily on Ararat. And the other is that its location was such that common people could visit the site. He said, "Of this ship there still remains a portion in the mountains of the Gordians in Armenia, and men scrape off pieces which they take away and use as amulets to ward off evil." For many centuries thereafter, pilgrims came to visit what they believed were the remains of Noah's Ark. Rocks and caves within the area are rich with ancient religious symbols, evidence of pilgrims visiting a holy site. Whatever they were visiting, it was not buried within a glacier so high and remote that only expert mountain climbers could reach it. The reality of a massive flood in Noah's time is supported by geological evidence. But there must have been powerful forces at work to create that flood. One of the more plausible explanations is that the earth was covered with incredibly high tides, tides which were caused by a gravitational interaction with a large body from space passing very close. Our own moon can create tides as high as 30 feet in some places, so an object of much greater size, perhaps the size of Mars, if passing very close, could easily have created tides which would have drained the oceans and sent them swirling across our continents. In that scenario, the liquid core of the Earth would also experience great upwelling tides, and these would have triggered earthquakes and massive volcanic eruptions. Mount Ararat is covered year-round with glaciers today, but underneath the ice, it's a dormant volcano.
So in the subsequent years, these different people have been poking around in the ice fields of Mount Ararat, and I've been skeptical from the onset that they just did not know they did not understand what they're doing.
Donald Patton has written several books explaining the geophysical forces which could have caused the ancient tides. These books include The Biblical Flood and the Ice Epic, Catastrophism and the Old Testament, and The Long Day of Joshua.
Well, when something comes within 40 or 50,000 miles, the steepness of that slope of the tidal interaction just rises very fast. Now, we believe that at the moment of the perigee, the closest point of this flyby, the tides or the tidal pull was about 30 to 35,000 times greater than the moon. There were tides not only in the oceans, but there were tides in the magma under the crust of the earth. And Mount Ararat, on the day of the flood, would have had to been a brand new volcano, belching hot. What a terrible place for the ark to land.
On November 13, 1948, an Associated Press dispatch from Istanbul told that a Kurdish farmer named Rashid had discovered Noah's Ark. The story contained the usual elements of previous accounts. It said the ark was half buried in the ice. It was made of wood, and of course it was on Mount Ararat. But there were other elements which seemed out of place. The article said Rashid had been to this spot many times before without seeing the structure. It said that local villagers had also witnessed it. And finally it said that there was no tradition of the ark being in that area, which caused everyone to be surprised at seeing it there. All of this was contrary to the statement that Rashid's boat was in a glacier on Mount Ararat. The news of this discovery sparked the imagination of Reverend Aaron J. Smith, Dean of the People's Bible College in Greensboro, North Carolina. Reverend Smith organized an archeological expedition, and in 1950 went to the foothills of Mount Ararat to locate Rashid. But the hill people there had never heard of such a man, and Reverend Smith, like so many others, returned home empty-handed. But Rashid was real. He did report finding a boat-shaped object in an area he had seen many times before. There was no recent legend of the Ark being there. The local people did visit the object at their leisure, and Rashid was known to them all. The problem was that the newspaper account was only half true. Rashid's discovery was not in a glacier on Mount Ararat. It was on the gentle slope of a hill 17 miles away.
Here's the man who discovered Noah's Ark in 1948. He is the Rashid that was mentioned in Cummings' book.
David Fasold from San Diego, California, is the man who finally located Rashid after 38 years. He is one of the first researchers to consider the possibility that Noah's Ark might not be on Mount Ararat. Author of the book, The Ark of Noah, Mr. Fasold is a former merchant marine officer and has spent many years in the salvage of sunken ships. He's an avid amateur archaeologist and is accomplished in languages of the Middle East.
He's there on the left, Ali Oglu Rashid Sarihan. And of course, when people read about the account of him discovering the Ark, they immediately went to Ararat and asked everyone, where's Rashid? And he was a mystery man. Nobody could find him.
Rashid Sarahan was born in the village of Dobayazit and spent his entire life in that area as a farmer and sheep herder. When interviewed in 1986, his memory of the discovery was still quite clear.
In 1948, there was an earthquake, and before this earthquake, it was a flat ground. They were planting on it, and it was covered with grass. And the earthquake repeated 3 times in 10 to 15 days. And the first time of this earthquake, it appeared. And the second time, it came up higher. And the third time, it took this shape.
Rashid's discovery remained unnoticed by the outside world until 1959, when it was accidentally photographed from the air by a Turkish pilot working on a government map-making program. When the cartographer in charge of the project announced that the boat-shaped object could not be a natural formation, the story was picked up by the international wire services and carried in American newspapers. An expedition to investigate the site was organized by René Norbergen, author and researcher from the United States. He was joined by George Vandeman, a well-known television evangelist. With the cooperation of the Turkish government, the team was escorted by a small contingent of soldiers, accompanied by Captain İlhan Durupanar, the man who first identified the formation from aerial photographs. They arrived at the site in June of 1960 and began to dig. 5,000-year-old timbers at that elevation would long ago have rotted, leaving behind only outlines of pigment in the soil. Nevertheless, the investigators were looking for wood. After digging 3 trenches, all they found was clay and rock. Finally, at the end of their patience, they used dynamite to blow several holes in the side. But as before, all that was dislodged was what appeared to be dirt. So the expedition returned to the United States and pronounced that the object was merely a geological formation. The September 5, 1960 issue of Life magazine carried the story, and hopeful eyes turned once again to Mount Ararat. For 2 more decades, the great structure lay wounded and ignored by mankind. Then in 1977, Ron Wyatt, an amateur archaeologist from Madison, Tennessee, inspected the site with a metal detector and obtained evidence of metallic deposits within the walls. In 1984, he submitted soil samples to a laboratory for analysis and was told they contained traces of man-made alloys. During a visit to the neighboring village of Kazan, he was shown ancient anchor stones similar to those used on seagoing vessels thousands of years ago. But these were almost 6,000 feet above sea level and 2,000 miles from the nearest ocean. While Ron Wyatt was making these discoveries in Turkey, David Fasold was independently pursuing his own research among ancient manuscripts.
One of the things that I was always puzzling with was this document written by Berosus, the the interpreter of Belus. He was the high priest of Babylon, and wrote this document around 281 BC. It was in a letter, actually, to Antiochus I, one of Alexander the Great's generals, in where he said what I believe to be the geographical location for Noah's Ark.
Berosus wrote that the ark was still in existence in his day and was visited by religious pilgrims. He also gave its measurement as being 5 stadia long and 2 stadia wide. A stadium in ancient Greece was the measure of a track used for foot races and was 607 feet long. If the size of Noah's Ark was being described in terms of racetracks, it would have been over 3,000 feet long and 1,200 feet wide, an unlikely dimension, which has caused many historians to dismiss Berosus as a myth-maker. David Fasold was not so sure and began to suspect that the word stadia might have been a mistranslation from the original manuscript. He discovered that the Greek symbol for stadium is similar to the Egyptian symbol for Tomera, which means the land of the Mer, or Egypt itself. But Mer also meant a right triangle, which was used in land surveying and geography. The length of its perpendicular sides was always in the ratio of 5 to 2, precisely the same as the figures given by Berosus. Fasold theorized that if the word Tomera is substituted for the word stadium, then Berosus was not giving dimensions of the ark, he was giving coordinates for its location.
And so with that in mind, I concentrated on how you would give a geographical location on the earth during Persian times, and came to a location on the chart in Turkey. 5 Tomera would be 90 degrees, and 2 Tomera would be 36 degrees, so by necessity the other angle has to be 74, and we have 2 crossing lines about 17 miles south of Mount Ararat.
17 miles south of Mount Ararat. Although Fasold did not know it at the time, that was precisely the location of Rashid's boat. By 1985, David Fasold had applied geometry to the ancient writings of Berosus and theorized a geographical location for Noah's Ark. Although he didn't know it at the time, it was the exact spot where a large boat-like formation had appeared following an earthquake 37 years earlier. After visiting the site for himself, he began to study old maps of the region and to make inquiries in the villages nearby. Here is what he found. The Quran says that Noah's Ark came to rest on Mount Judi. There are 3 mountains in Turkey called Judi. 2 of them are hundreds of miles distant, but the largest of them is located directly above the boat formation. We are told that a raven or crow was sent aloft by Noah, but returned to the ark when it couldn't find a place to land. This account appears in Genesis, the Torah, the Quran, and in the Epic of Gilgamesh. 2 miles from the present boat formation is a small village named Garkokanmaz, which means crow will not land. In many of the ancient texts dealing with the flood, those on board the ark were referred to as heroes who had survived the Last Judgment, and thereafter people made a pilgrimage to what remained of the vessel. Fasold learned from the villagers and from old maps that other mountain peaks surrounding the site carried such names as Heroes' Anchorage, the Last Judgment, and Voluntary Pilgrimage.
We have the mountain up there that what I showed on the chart was called Yit Yataki, excuse me, Yit Yataki, and Yit is hero, and Taki means a bed, couch, or mattress. If it's spelled Y-A-T-A-K, Yatak or Yataki, but if it's spelled G-I, and indeed on the map it is spelled Y-A-T-A-G-I, it takes on the maritime meaning. And if that's the case, it means hero's anchorage or berth. Now, in Aubrey's translation of the Quran, it says it a little bit different. It says, in the name of Allah, it will set sail to its berth and anchorage. But here in Dawood's translation, it says, in the Surahud 1140, it says, Noah said, embark in it. It will set sail in the name of Allah, and in the name of Allah it will cast anchor. Which leads us now into the subject of, if this isn't Noah's Ark, what are these anchor stones doing here?
A group of large stones is located adjacent to the nearby village of Kazan. At first it was assumed these were merely old tombstones, but closer examination revealed many of them were actually anchor stones, similar to the ones found around ancient shipwrecks along the Mediterranean coast. But these were much larger than any found before, one of them estimated to weigh as much as 20,000 pounds. It was difficult to imagine a ship large enough to use not just one, but many stones of this size. But most puzzling of all, they were 2,000 miles from the nearest ocean and over 5,000 feet above sea level. Nautical stones are quite different from tombstones. They have a hole at one end for a rope, and they have a special shape for minimizing turbulence when dragged through the water.
The shape of most of them, 10 of the 11 that we looked at, are wide on one end and thin, about 8 inches thick and be maybe 5 feet wide. Then at the other end, they're only 2 feet wide and about varying from 18 inches to 2 feet thick.
Sam Windsor is a marine engineer who specializes in determining the cause of maritime accidents. He is nationally recognized as an expert in ship structures and fluid dynamics.
Then there's a hole drilled that's in a curved hole. I don't know how we would do it. I don't know how to drill curved holes. We only see curved holes drilled in rock one other place in the world, and that's in the Mayan temples down South America, or Central America. But these holes are drilled in curves through the thick end, and the holes vary in diameter. It's interesting that the hole diameters correspond to the size of the stone. If the stone is a 4-ton stone, I measured a 3-inch diameter hole on a 9-inch radius of curvature. When the hole diameter was 4.5 inches, the stone I was looking at was about 10 tons, and the radius of curvature of the hole was 12 inches. You can't curve a big rope as tight as you can curve a smaller rope. You must curve them to keep them from fraying on the edges.
The weight of the anchor is not what performs the job. It'd be better to call them a drogue stone. Of course, in Turkish they call them a gemi tashi, ship stone. And Herodotus describes how the Egyptians used them going down the Nile River. What it does is it keeps your stern in irons, in nautical terminology. In other words, if your vessel is being moved across the surface of the water by the wind and the action of the waves, a wave could hit the stern and turn the boat sideways, and then the next wave could hit your boat broadside, and you could start to roll the boat. So you throw out these stern anchors, and as the boat's being pushed forward, the surface area of the stone being trailed through the water restricts the movement of the boat, so that the line is always taut.
The stones near the village of Kazan bear carvings of what may be early Christian symbols, but some of the markings appear to be much older.
The concept of Noah's Ark, the Babylonian concept, was that it was 6 stories high. This has got only 6 levels, so it's not a ziggurat. It's a graphic representation of Noah's Ark. So even though these crosses were put on by the early Christians, this could have been put on by Babylonian or Assyrian influence.
In June of 1985, David Fasold returned to Turkey to have a better look at the Ark with electronic instruments. He was accompanied by Ron Wyatt and also Dr. John Baumgardner, a scientist from the Los Alamos National Laboratory. Using 3 types of metal detectors, they obtained thousands of readings from what appear to be the remains of iron spikes and fittings.
I said that looks like iron, okay? Right under this stake right here, and we get a strong signal from it. Okay?
Okay.
This looks a little more like what I've been seeing. I think it's this rock that gives me the signal.
The rock or the protrusion?
The rock.
Okay. Oh, look at that. Oh, well, wait a minute. Wait a minute. Let me get a close-up of that. Kind of,
You want my hand in there for?
yeah, just to point at those little
Okay.
flakes of iron that are coming out, like right there. There and there. Well,
I'd save those frames right there.
okay.
One of the electronic instruments used was a molecular frequency generator discriminator. It's sometimes confused with dowsing because it requires the use of rods held by an operator. It's a controversial instrument because no one knows exactly how it works or why it works on some occasions and not on others. But that it does work has been proven by the many buried treasures it has successfully located.
See, there's my intermediate. Okay, the one where the guy with the red hat's sitting on, that one's right here. Okay, my next one is here. Okay, now I skipped one, I should have it here. That's the next one I skipped. And now this is where we're going to bring it. See? Okay, now that's the tape, that's that tape coming up here.
When the markers were connected with survey ribbons, they reveal longitudinal and transverse lines showing what may have been former beams and bulkhead supports, laid out in clear geometric patterns.
4.
Okay. See one more in there.
5. 6. Man, you tell me this thing doesn't work, Ron. Give me a break. This is the boat.
Say it didn't work, fella. Somebody else.
To confirm the composition of what was producing the metal detector readings, a sample was taken from the soil. Back in the hotel room, Dr. Baumgardner comments.
It's striking in the fact of its angular character. Seem to have some preferred planes in the object on the outside as well as the inside. This inner portion appears to be a silica replacement of something. This would represent, if the interpretation is correct, a portion of an angle bracket, and we see a corner of it here. It's interesting that it apparently still displays the grain structure of the iron.
Now, does this seem to be cast iron or wrought iron?
I would say it's has the character of wrought iron, and it appears that this is almost pure iron oxide here, this outer portion.
What would you estimate would be the percentage of chance that this thing just happened out there, that it was not man-made at all?
I would think there's essentially zero probability that it's a natural object. It's certainly a man-made object. This has to be a man-made structure. It's full of metal. The metal has a regular pattern to it, and the size of the thing and the shape of the thing is such that it's almost certainly a large boat.
Fasold returned the following year with a ground-penetrating radar unit, the kind used by geologists to identify subsurface formations.
Okay, start walking, De La Vere. There's the longitudinal bulkheads. You ought to see them popping out, Ron. There's one right here. There's another one. Oh, man. Woo! Look at them. There's the keel line right there. Oh, Ron, the lines are there! The lines are there.
The size and shape of Noah's Ark is a topic which has troubled historians for centuries. One of the problems is uncertainty regarding the length of a cubit. English tradition holds that a cubit was the length of one's forearm, from 17 to 22 inches. Hebrew tradition sets it at 18 inches. Since the book of Genesis is believed to have been written by Moses, and since Moses was a Hebrew, many biblical scholars have used the Hebrew cubit to calculate the length of Noah's Ark at 450 feet. But there's another cubit which is much older. It was used by the Egyptians in the construction of the pyramids. It's measured at 20.6 inches. Moses was raised by an Egyptian princess in the house of Pharaoh and educated by Egyptian scholars. Undoubtedly, he was taught their standard of measure. If Moses had used the Egyptian cubit in describing the ark, then it would not be 450 feet long. It would be 515. When David Fassold stretched his tape measure along the center line, he could hardly believe his eyes. He recorded in his field notebook 515 feet. But there was a problem with the width of the ark. Genesis says it was 50 cubits wide, which would be about 86 feet. The actual dimension was 138 feet at the widest point measured. If the ark had been constructed as a large rectangular box, a measurement of the width would pose no problem because it would be the same all the way along. But here was a boat-shaped object. Was the measurement to be taken at the widest point, or was 50 cubits an average width? Was it at the waterline or the upper deck? David Fassold has drawn upon his nautical background and proposed an intriguing solution to this puzzle. He theorized that the measurements of the ark were not dimensions of a rectangular box, but a description of its volume. The size of a house is commonly described in square feet, but that doesn't mean the house is square. Storage tanks are rated by cubic feet, but they're cylinders, not cubes. Likewise, the storage capacity of a ship is stated in terms of the volume of water it displaces, which can be expressed as a cube or a three-dimensional rectangle, but that has nothing to do with its true shape. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the deck of the ark was described not as a rectangle, but as an area equal to the square of 120 cubits. That area was called an iku, and it is the origin of our present-day word, acre. It's common today to portray Noah's Ark as a rectangular barge, but according to marine engineer Sam Windsor, a narrow box is only 1/4 as stable as a tapered boat. Had the ark been a long rectangle, it would have capsized in a rough sea. The formation that lies in the mountains of Ararat appears to have been shaped like the Egyptian boats that sailed the Nile thousands of years ago, great uplifted ends curling inward and anchored to the deck, providing structural strength. It would be thousands of years before man could build another ship to equal its dimensions. It was more than half the size of the Queen Mary. When checking with metal detectors, a series of foundation stones were discovered along each side of the bow. These platforms are precisely where they need to be to support compression poles fastened to the tip of an uplifted arch. It is inconceivable that the placement of these structures could be a random accident of nature. One of the startling features of the ark's design was the existence of what today's shipbuilders call a moon pool. It was a large rectangular hole with sides deliberately built into the center of the ship, much like our present-day salvage vessels which can raise objects through the middle of their hulls. This device could have performed several important functions. Water trapped inside the pool would be dragged along with the ship and act as a hydraulic brake to slow it down. Rainwater falling on the upper structure could have been diverted for the purpose of cleaning out animal compartments, with the debris washed down through the center. The rising and falling of waves inside the moon pool would have acted like a piston, moving the air up and down, in and out, functioning as a ventilating system for the interior chambers. The moon pool also served to relieve stress on the ship as it rode across cresting waves. This was accomplished by allowing some of the water to push up into the opening rather than raising the entire hull. Without this feature, a ship that large would have straddled the waves, and its ends would have sagged from gravity as they extended into the air. It was soon realized that the design of Noah's Ark was based upon two mathematical concepts known as pi and phi. Pi is the ratio of the circumference of a circle to its diameter, and when carried to only 3 digits, is expressed as 3.142. Phi, also called the golden ratio or the golden rectangle, is the number obtained by adding 1 to the square root of 5 and then dividing by 2. Rounded off to 3 digits, it's expressed as 1.618. The golden ratio shows up in many natural formations, such as the arrangement of the seeds in a sunflower and the curve of horns on a ram. It's particularly common in formations related to water. It mathematically describes the spiral of a nautilus seashell and the inside of a breaking wave. It is used today in the construction of ships' hulls to minimize water turbulence. The ratios of pi and phi are evident in every major aspect of the Ark's construction. Precise mathematical relationships of this kind are not the result of chance. Yet here in this design there is not just one such relationship, but 5. There can be little doubt that this structure was built by man, and whoever designed it applied principles of mathematics and hydrodynamics that were not fully known again for almost 5,000 years.
If you superscribe a rectangle around the shape as it lays out there now, if you divide the actual area of the artifact into that rectangle, you get 1.618 phi. If you divide that area by the length, and you got to be sitting down for this one. If you say that the length is 300 cubits, you divide that length into the area of the deck, you get 49.7 cubits. The average width of the artifact is 50 cubits. So I don't believe in coincidence. I'm reasonably certain the Bible's accurate on that point, that 30 or 31, but we're near 30, or we're at 30 cubits. For depth, we're at 50 cubits for average width, and we're at 300 cubits for length. So I think it's the artifact. I think this was Noah's Ark.
It's commonly assumed that the Ark was made entirely of wood. This appears to be confirmed in Genesis, which according to most translations says it was made of gopher wood. But the word gopher was taken from the original Hebrew without any knowledge of what it meant. In fact, it didn't necessarily mean wood at all. The word wood was added centuries later by a translator. The New English Bible is more specific. It says the ark was covered with reeds, and there's much evidence to support that conclusion. During the early 1900s, in the days of the great ocean sailing ships, builders learned that the longest wooden vessel that could withstand rough seas was about 300 feet. Anything over that would flex and twist until its joints would loosen or come apart completely. The longest wooden ship ever put into service was the Wyoming, the last of the 6-masted freighters. At 330 feet, she was considered to be untrustworthy. The structure that lies in the mountains of Ararat is almost twice as long as the Wyoming. It's likely that wooden timbers were used for upright supports and flooring, but the area below the main deck appears to have been made primarily of reeds. Today there are stone-like pieces near the formation which show impressions of reed-like structures on the surface. They have a hollow sound when struck, and they appear to be a manufactured stone composed of layers of different materials. Many of the ancient texts agree that the ark was covered with some kind of substance, probably to make it watertight and to bind the reeds together. Translators use the words pitch or tar. Some call it bitumen. All three words mean essentially the same thing, a natural tar that oozes out of the ground. But that was separate from what was called oil, which also was used. It has been assumed that this was an organic oil derived from plants or tree sap. The fossil remains that can be seen today confirm that legend. The reeds appear to have been plastered on the inside with an organic resinous oil and layered on the outside with a mixture of pumice, natural tar, and natron, forming a kind of asphalt cement that would have been well suited for its task. One of the ancient Hebrew words for a covering of this kind is kafar, or in English, gopher. There are different accounts of how many humans and what kind of animals were aboard the ark. The book of Genesis identifies 8 people, including Noah, his wife, and his sons and their wives. Some have said that because only 8 were mentioned, there couldn't possibly have been anyone else. But that may be a premature conclusion, considering the size of the vessel and the work required to tend animals and handle anchor stones. The Quran says that Noah took aboard all believers, although few in number. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim loaded all his relatives, his craftsmen, and their children on board, and even identified his boatman by name as Puzur Amuru. It is not difficult to imagine his vessel staffed with a large and hard-working crew. We are told in Genesis that Noah was to bring on board 2 of every kind of animal. It didn't say whether this was every kind in the entire world, or every kind that was natural to the local area, or every kind that served a purpose for Noah. And since it didn't specify, the common assumption has been that it meant the entire world. And that has become the basis of the typical Sunday school image of the ark as a kind of floating zoo. This interpretation has led many people to reject the entire story. It's difficult to believe that creatures which existed on the other side of the planet would be able to reach the ark, walking and swimming literally halfway around the earth. The solution to this puzzle may have been found in the Sumerian and Babylonian tablets. They tell us that the purpose of animals aboard the ark was not to preserve every creature on the planet, but to provide food and clothing for Noah and his crew. Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh that he took only farm animals, those that eat grass and would remain at his door. Early editions of the Old Testament were in agreement with that view. The King James Version mentions birds and creeping things, but the only animals specifically named were cattle, nothing else. It wasn't until more recent times that translators and revision committees began to interpret the text to conform to the popular image. The strongest opposition to this amazing discovery has come not from those who are opposed to religion and who reject the stories in holy books, but from those who have preconceived beliefs about the ark and who are not about to change. They are committed to the notion that Noah's ark has to be on Mount Ararat, must be entirely of wood, can only be rectangular in shape, and must have been measured by the Hebrew cubit. And so it wasn't long before the boat formation was being explained as something else. It has been speculated to be a mudslide, or an ancient Mongol fortress, or a sunken pleasure yacht belonging to a king of Persia, or even a replica of Noah's Ark constructed by Constantine. Any explanation will do for those who cannot accept that this just might be the real thing. There is, of course, a possibility that the theory advanced in this presentation also is wrong. It would be foolhardy to state with certainty that the case is closed when there is so much about the formation yet to be learned. The time has come for the Turkish government to lead an international team of investigators representing all theological and scientific viewpoints to confirm the initial findings and to probe for additional data. But even then, there undoubtedly will be skeptics and naysayers, because unless they dig up a brass plaque with the words, "Built by Noah and Sons," there's no way to be 100% certain. Nevertheless, based on the evidence we do have right now, we can formulate several important conclusions. It's a man-made object. It was designed as a boat. It incorporates principles of higher mathematics and a sophisticated knowledge of hydrodynamics. It's the proper dimension and volume for the ark. It's in the proper geographical location. It's accompanied by anchor stones of an appropriate size, and these are almost 6,000 feet above present sea level. It's in an area which for thousands of years was visited by religious pilgrims. It's surrounded by mountains and villages which carry names from antiquity relating to the ark's landing. And it's consistent with the ancient flood stories from Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon, as well as the Torah, the Old Testament, and the Koran. If this isn't Noah's Ark, it appears to be somebody's ark. And until they find that brass plaque, we'll each have to draw our own conclusions regarding who built it. In the meantime, thanks for coming on board.